Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, and time to talk about probably the big issue in the world at the moment. The world is being shaken to its very core foundations by the collision of energy, climate change, and the clashing power of nations in a time of global crisis, really. We see the shale revolution in oil and gas. It certainly made the US economy energy independent for the first time since the 70s. It introduced a turbulent new era, though, and almost overnight, a lot of the warnings in my next guest's book almost came to pass, as we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But all of this is taking place in the context of a world as well that is trying to decarbonize as quickly as it can to reach commitments that were agreed to at the Paris Convention of the Parties, the COP, and the Paris Climate Agreement, as it's known. It's a great pleasure to welcome Pulitzer Prize winner Daniel Yergin, who really ties all of these strands together like few others. And I believe, Daniel, that a new edition of the new map has been published. So welcome to the show. I need to get my hands on that because I haven't read the updated edition. How have you been?
Well, I've been fine. I mean, as you know, it's been a very time has passed so quickly, and from pre-COVID to COVID to sort of post-COVID. But we're in a much more turbulent and a much more dangerous world than even when we met and spoke a couple of years ago.
Indeed, indeed. Now, let's start really with your journey firstly before we dive into some of those issues, because you're vice chairman of our HIS Markit, which is a global research and information company.
Now I'm one of the other things that's changed. I'm now vice chairman of S&P Global. We've done a merger that closed last March. So it's 35,000 people around the world.
Wow. That I mean, continues your work, though, in energy research and consultancy. And that was really where you started. You had your own consultancy, Cambridge Energy Research, back in 2004. And you've authored and co-authored lots of books on energy and world economics, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money and Power, The Quest, which is all about energy security and the remaking of the modern world, and most recently, The New Map, which now you've published as an updated edition. So clearly you've done a lot.
And it's funny, Michael, because people, somebody said to me, "Oh, you've written a trilogy," and I didn't think about it as a trilogy, but I guess in a way I would think about it as a trilogy. And they'll say to me, "Well, what's your next book?" And I said, I'm living the new map. We're all living the new map right now. And so, we're in the middle of it.
How did you get to this point, to reach this point where the New York Times called you America's most influential energy pundit?
Well, yeah, that was, that kind of commendation always makes one nervous to be described like that. I think what happened, I mean, this goes back a long time ago. I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. And basically for 2 years, no one was supervising me, so I could do what I wanted. And I just became obsessed with energy and ended up, for odd reasons, at the Harvard Business School and did the first energy book there. And it's just been, the subject of energy stretches from everything from geopolitics to technology to markets and all of those things. And so I just, so that becomes a kind of framework through which I look at the world, and it's endlessly fascinating, and it's always changing. It doesn't stand still.
No, it's like a river. You never enter, the same river twice. Now, your most recent book, as I said, is The New Map. We've discussed it on a previous platform in the past. So worth reminding us what The New Map is all about. And you say we're living in it right now. And I was just amazed because reading it, and I think I last spoke to you just before COVID started here in South Africa, you really foresaw a lot of the things that were about to unfold, specifically with regards to Russia and the weaponization of gas in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, as I was writing the book, I said, it really was started off thinking the new map, look at how the flows of energy around the world have changed and what does that mean for politics and nations. And one of the major things I focused in on was this relationship between Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and Russian gas. And you could just see that, Putin would say that Ukraine is not a country. 2/3 of it should belong to Russia, and that gas had become the kind of vector along which they struggled. And so that's why, I said that that was the issue. It just seems so logical that that was the issue that was going to blow up between Russia and the West. Didn't think it would blow up this way. And I don't think anybody on February 23rd had a scenario that there would be a 7-month war and it would be where it is today, and with Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons.
No, and that is, the frightening thing is that we have seen a huge ratcheting up of tensions between Russia and the West over NATO. Some speculate that there's a Novorossiya type idea that's built up inside the Kremlin ever since Putin took the office.
I think that's quite correct, Michael. I think that's exactly clear that this is not about sort of rebuilding the Soviet Union so much as the Russian Empire. And that I think maybe his 2 years of extreme isolation for Putin during COVID, where he wasn't meeting CEOs, he wasn't meeting heads of states, he wasn't being a big guy on the world stage, maybe all these things just fermented in his mind and led to this thing that, he had a strike. And, he had a series of calculations, all of which were rational and all of which were wrong. He thought that his army was strong. He thought Ukraine would not respond. He thought the U.S. was a mess because of the January 6th riots at the Capitol, Afghanistan. And he thought Europe was so dependent on Russian energy that it would say, just with what it did with Crimea, oh, this is terrible, but life will go on. And on all of those so far, he's been wrong.
Now, how are you reading this playing out from an energy perspective? Because if you look at it, the European energy sector is feeling a lot of strain. That we saw gas prices spike, particularly because of the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia. Most recently, we've seen the explosions around the Nord Stream pipeline, and there's still some speculation as to what happened there. How are you seeing this conflict between the two nations having such a profound impact on the global energy sector? How do you see this playing out?
It has been, we had a global energy crisis that began well before February 24th, which was the date of the Russian invasion. But what you now have is a collision between a global energy crisis and a global geopolitical crisis. And Putin laid out a strategy in June at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He said, high prices for gas in Europe create economic hardship, create social turmoil, bring populist parties together, and as he said, change the elites. And then what he didn't say is destroy the coalition supporting Ukraine. So that's what he's in a sense, with natural gas, he's opened a second front in the Ukraine war, and it's in the gas market in Europe. And even though gas prices have come down somewhat, those prices are still as much as 10 times normal. And the impact is being felt around the world, where developing countries that would depend upon LNG can't afford it. So they're either burning coal or they're having blackouts. And it's certainly feeding into both inflation and at the same time to what seems to be coming, which is probably a global recession.
And we also see several Eastern countries continue to benefit from energy deals with Russia, including India and China. How is this affecting the balance of the global energy sector?
Well, it's a reshaping of the energy flows. Europe was Russia's main market for oil and for gas. Those oil supplies are now being diverted to India and China, where they're being sold at a discount. So oil that used to go to India is now going to go to Europe. The gas market the global gas market has been really disrupted. But the Indian foreign minister said the other day, high oil prices are killing us. So if they can get oil at a discount, they sure are going to buy it. And it means, so a lot of countries are not, the OECD countries, the Western Europe, some in Asia, of course, North America, have all, broken with Russia. Not true with much of the developing world, which is sort of saying, we're kind of in the middle. We'll straddle. This is your problem, not our problem. Our problem is, as the Indian foreign minister said, he said, our problem is fuel, fertilizer, and food. That's what their problem is. And all of those prices have been driven up by this conflict.
In fact, one of the mining CEOs at a recent conference here in South Africa, Neil Froneman of Sibanye, was saying we probably will benefit from being in the middle here when it comes to being able to deal both with the East and the West as South Africa when it comes to this race for battery minerals and all of these so-called green minerals that form part of the renewable energy build-out. Now, that really brings me to the other major challenge that the energy sector faces is this need to address the climate change situation. And because of what we've seen in Germany and elsewhere, I think it's creating fertile ground for those people who are resisting changing from coal and oil and gas to saying, well, look what's happened in Europe. We mustn't move too quickly. How do you see this impacting the climate change debate?
I think the direction is clear, but I think there's some very prominent economists who've raised a concern about moving too fast, that it really will create economic shocks. And to some degree, they look at the energy crisis that began a year ago and said, is this the first energy crisis of the energy transition because of what I've called preemptive underinvestment, meaning that not sufficient investment is going into conventional resources where the demand is going to continue to grow on the premise that everything over here is ready to go, but everything is not ready to go. And so if you do it too fast, you get, in a sense, the kind of backlash, Michael, that you're describing, which is people saying, you know, this is too expensive, it's too disruptive. Do we really want to do this? And so I think that getting the timing right on the energy transition is really important, and addressing the needs of developing countries, because I see a new north-south divide on energy transition. Between, you had the example just in September of the European Parliament passing a resolution denouncing the proposed pipeline, oil pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania to the Indian Ocean, and saying that they shouldn't go ahead with it because of climate and so forth. And the Ugandans say, this is imperialism. We're a poor country. Our per capita income is less than 1/20th of the per capita income of France, where the European Parliament is. So I see the development issues for developing countries also being a priority. And I think that, to me, it seems that the perspective of the developing world has somewhat been left out of the global discussion.
And we're going to be seeing, I think, more of that conversation playing out at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt later on this year. It is being built, because it's in Africa, somewhat of an emerging market COP. And there's all this talk about, well, what is the fair deal, considering that the global north in that north-south debate has already developed on the back of fossil fuels and now is being asked to leapfrog and transition via renewables. But I recall in the new map, I mean, you say transitions like this take decades, if not hundreds of years, yet we're trying to achieve this in a couple of decades.
Yeah, so one of the things in the new map that I wanted to explore is everybody's talking about energy transition. So what are energy transitions? So I look back at all the previous energy transitions, and I actually, Michael went out on a limb and said the energy transition began in January 1709 when a British English metalworker found out that you could make iron better using coal rather than wood. But as you say, these unfolded over a century, and they were energy additions. So oil overtakes coal in the 1960s. Today, as the number one energy source today, the world uses 3 times as much coal. Now we're talking about, in a quarter of a century, doing something entirely different, which is changing the entire energy foundations of what's roughly a $90 trillion world economy in a quarter of a century. And, you have to be a little bit modest. It's a very big challenge when Africa, which only produces 3% of the world's CO2, is also has priorities around development, reducing poverty, improving health, having people no longer burning wood or waste for indoor cooking. So I think, so I just tried in the new map to sort of bring some balance to the discussion, because a lot of words fly around without what do those words really mean?
Yeah. And I recall you touched on, what does a just transition mean for India? Where they burn a lot of kerosene and that kind of thing for cooking, and
right, and they burn a lot of coal, and they're building a $60 billion natural gas distribution system, which is very different, than what the EU wants. And I mean, I had a few months ago, I chaired a session with a number of African energy ministers. And one of the big topics was their inability to get financing for things they think they need, like a natural gas pipeline. And I remember the energy minister of Senegal, she talked about how they need to build this pipeline so women don't have to spend 3 hours a day gathering wood and then cooking with it and so forth. And the European banks won't provide funding. And the way she put it, it's like they've taken away the ladder for development from us. And she said, what do they expect us to do? To jump or to fly? And so that's what I'm hearing from developing countries around this issue, that their voice and their priorities are not being taken into account by people whose per capita income is 20 or 30 times higher than theirs.
It sounds to me like there's going to have to be some compromises at a global level when we look at the developmental context of every single country and where it is at the moment. If we then just come back to Europe and we have a look at what's going on over there, could a commitment to cleaner energy sources serve as a solution to European countries' reliance on Russian energy sources? And I ask that because, I mean, it's being used as this geopolitical tool by Vladimir Putin. Surely countries are now going to say, well, we can't set ourselves up to be beholden to that in the future.
Right. Well, I think the answer is both. I mean, Germany really depended upon Russian gas very significantly. They didn't put any money or effort into energy security and into sort of having alternatives. Now they're putting 5 floating liquefied natural gas, LNG regasification facilities into place. So I think and what's happened now is, you mentioned U.S. shale. U.S. shale gas is now seen as kind of one of the foundations of European energy security, because now people are thinking about energy security. At the same time, the Europeans, like the Biden administration here, are going to step up the commitment to renewables and put more money. And so it's kind of a two-prong movement. But it's striking to see that, I could see the Europeans, companies, officials are coming to the U.S. looking to sign up 20-year deals with U.S. LNG exporters. So it's going to be a combination of the two.
And ultimately, a good news story for the U.S. Shale industry, which has been, and according, looking through the new map, one of the big game changers that we've seen ever since the 1970s in the global geopolitics of energy, in that it allowed the US to be far more energy independent, and so therefore can take a different political strategy in regions of the world like the Middle East and Europe now.
I think, that's definitely there, and you hear that concern in the Middle East. And the person who really saw early on the geopolitical significance of it is a man named Vladimir Putin. I have the story in the book about, I was at the St. Petersburg conference several years ago, and he was on the stage with Chancellor Merkel of Germany, and so they said I could ask the first question. So I asked him the standard question: what are you going to do about diversifying your economy so you're not dependent on the oil and gas? But I mentioned the word shale. He interrupted me. He started shouting at me. He said, shale is barbaric. It's terrible. And I'm slumped down in my seat. He's shouting at me in front of 3,000 people. Not a nice experience, but it was like an explosion. But afterwards, I thought there were 2 reasons he didn't like shale. One is that he saw it would compete with Russian gas in Europe, which is exactly what's happening. Indeed, it's replacing Russian gas in Europe. And secondly, it's the point you just made, Michael. It would augment U.S. influence in the world. The U.S. sells LNG now to China. It was geopolitically significant as well. So the shale revolution, and I think Europe, a year or 2 ago, France turned away a cargo of U.S. LNG because it was shale gas. Now France wants U.S. LNG, and forget the fact that they didn't want it before. And they do see U.S. LNG now as an essential building block for energy security, even as they work on moving towards cleaner energy.
Yeah, yeah, and it's now all about having the infrastructure because, I mean, as you mentioned, you have to bring in floating regasification facilities because they didn't build as they did in Poland, for example. I was chatting to a gentleman from Poland who was part of a property tour to South Africa recently, and he said we were just laughing at the Germans over in Poland because we could see what was going to happen. I mean, a lot of it, I think, is in hindsight easy to see, but many of these predictions have come to pass. We haven't touched on China, though. And I think China's the sleeping dragon. Just in the midst of all of this, we've got Xi Jinping, who he's bidding to become effectively a ruler for life. Many say at the next Communist Party meeting. The Economist is running a great little podcast series called The Prince. If you want to know a little bit more about a man who's this very secretive, and a lot of the background is censored and scrubbed out if it's not okay in China. So difficult to get a handle. Yeah,
there is a Chinese edition of the new map coming out. And I believe some of the material of the kind you're talking about has disappeared in the Chinese edition.
So it goes to show you. But I mean, should we be concerned about Xi Jinping's bid to become ruler for life in China in this context?
Well, I think it's changing the Chinese economy, and what I called in the new map, the WTO consensus, World Trade Organization, that we're all in this together in globalization, that's broken down now. That's over. It's now, there's no question it's great power competition. There used to be people here in Washington who would, say the relationship is very important with China. We have to work on it. Now, I think the general stance is one of hostility. And I think it's the same on the Chinese side, that they're, these arrivals, their military are reorienting towards each other. And so even while we're focused on Ukraine and that war and whether Putin's going to use nuclear weapons, the larger geopolitical thing is the relationship between the U.S. and China. And, as you said, a lot of things were prescient in the new map. What I tried to do is also sketch out how this confrontation with the United States and China has developed. And I mean, there's a focus on Taiwan, but there's also a focus on the South China Sea.
Yeah. Yeah, that becoming this new theater of potential conflicts, we've already, we've seen a couple of close shaves in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
How does it play out from an energy perspective, though, if you were to put an energy lens on this?
Well, I mean, China, it's interesting. China has always been, the two countries that did not forget about energy security were Japan, very explicitly, and China. And even in their 14th five-year plan that came out last spring, they put energy security before decarbonization. So they're pushing ahead with wind and solar, but they're also building coal-fired power plants. And their strategy has been diversification. Now, I think as a result of this crisis, this Ukraine war, Russia has really been deintegrated from the Western, called the Western economy. And I think it's going to be increasingly an economic dependency of China and a source of raw materials for China. And that will bring revenues into Russia. But, you do wonder, at the Olympics, 3 weeks before the war, China, Xi and Putin talked about unlimited cooperation. You have to look at it and say, the Chinese look at what's happened and said, Putin's not doing a great job, so they have to worry about their partner. They have to worry. It's not in their interest to see nuclear weapons used. It's not in their interest to see Japan go nuclear and so forth. So they can't be unhappy with this destabilizing the world economy. And they're looking at growth rates well below, what they've historically had. I mean, I saw a recent growth rate that had China 2.8%. People used to think of it was always going to grow at 8 to 10%. But there's an economic reorientation certainly going on, and Russia is going to be more dependent upon China.
Yeah, and many will worry about stability in China at those kinds of growth rates. Do you have, as a concluding thought here, any predictions in that crystal ball of yours to share regarding the future of the global energy sector? How do you see all of these converging forces playing out?
Well, the thing I'm very focused on, I spent 8 months working on a study on copper, because one of the features of the changing the energy transition is moving from what I in the book call in the new map call big oil to big shovels, a lot of mining. And of course, mining is a very important subject for South Africa. And I think people are just beginning to understand the degree of minerals that you're going to need. We focused on copper because copper is the metal of electrification. And basically, to achieve the 2050 goals, looks to us like copper demand would have to double. Question, where do you get that from? Mm-hmm. And there will be a new geopolitics around minerals. 38% of world copper comes from two countries, Chile and Peru. 42% is smelted in China. So you can see that there will be a race for these minerals, and Africa has seen the race for the minerals, certainly. And so I think that's, I think if you look down the next couple of years, you're going to see a much bigger focus on that. And it will be, there'll be a new geopolitics of energy based around minerals rather than oil and gas.
Yeah, that's where some CEOs of big mining companies are trying to position themselves as well. So clearly they've also read the new map.
But Michael, if I can say, the problem is it's not easy to open a new mine. And even when we're having discussions with people in South Africa, everywhere you talk in the world, permitting is a really big problem. And the International Energy Agency says 16 years to open a new mine from discovery to production. And so kind of, where there are ample resources, but developing them gets into all those kind of political problems.
And that has fed through. I mean, in our renewable energy build program, we're in bid window 6. Bid window 5, though, is still tied up in legal issues because the bids were put in a year before the war in Ukraine, and so prices started rising around certain key inputs. And I think increasingly we're going to start to see that in the renewable value chain, prices for those key minerals start to rise because you just can't bring new production on stream fast enough. To your point, and clearly that'll have a role.
I mean, the wind and the sun are free, but you need an enormous amount of minerals. I mean, the electric car will use 2.5 times as much copper as a conventional car. So just to give you one example. So it's not just clean energy actually depends heavily on mining. And then even if you look at electric car, it's 20% plastic, and plastic's made from oil and gas. So, the picture is more complicated than the rhetoric.
Yeah,
the reality is more complicated than the rhetoric.
Absolutely. But Daniel, you've always had a good way of tying these big strands together to form a much clearer picture for readers. So as a journalist covering the sector, I really thank you for your time and for sharing your insights with us here on Business Talk on Business Tech. Take care.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's great to be talking with you again. So thank you.
That was Daniel Yergin, Pulitzer Prize-winning energy savant, talking about the global energy crisis and his latest book. And the new map is now in a reprint, a new edition as well. So I'm certainly going to go and get my hands on a copy. You've been watching Business Talk.